The document trembled in Elijah Carter's hands, though the Mississippi morning was still and heavy with unshed rain. The paper, crisp and official, bore the dense, looping script of County Clerk Henderson, a man whose spectacles perpetually slid down a nose reddened by whiskey and superiority. "Your mark here," Elijah said, Silas Ransom gesturing with a tobacco-stained finger. The plantation owner didn't point to the line. Elijah wouldn't know it anyway. But to the bottom of the page, avoid waiting for his illiterate signature. Fine terms. You work my 40 acres, you get a third of the yield. Fair as the day is long. Elijah, a man of 35, with eyes older than the Delta Hills, looked past Silas to the land. The 40 acres in question were Ransom's worst, low-lying, prone to flood, still choked with the skeletal stalks of last year's failed crop. Freedom, they'd said in '65. A quarter-century later, the air still tasted of bondage, just perfumed with different lies. "The tools, the seed," Elijah began, his voice a low rumble. "Advance to you on credit from my store." Silas smiled, a thin crack in a granite face. "Standard practice, you settle up after harvest. Now the mark." Around them, other freedmen shuffled in line, their families a silent, watchful backdrop of faded dresses and worn overalls. They were all doing it. To refuse was to be vagrant. To be vagrant was to be arrested. To be arrested was to be leased back to a man like Silas in chains, working for no pay at all. The law, a specter in a sheriff's star, leaned against a wagon watching. Elijah pressed his thumb into the ink pad Silas provided and stamped it on the line. The print, a whorl of unique identity, felt like the ceiling of a tomb. Silas blew on it, smiled wider, and handed the contract to the clerk. "Welcome to a new season, Elijah. Prosperity." That night in the one-room shack that housed Elijah, his wife Cora, and their 3 children, the document sat on the crude table like a cursed thing. Cora touched its edge. "What does it truly say, Lee?" "It says we're bound," he replied, staring into the fire. "But we were bound before I made that mark. This just makes it legal for them." Their eldest, Benjamin, 12, with eyes that missed nothing, spoke up. "I heard old man Moses talking. He said the store charges double. Said last year he picked 8 bales and owed ransom money at the end." Elijah met his son's gaze. "Then we picked 12. We outworked the debt." But the debt was a living thing. It began the next day at the Ransom & Son Mercantile. The seed, brittle and dusty, was tallied at a price that made Elijah flinch. The hoe, its handle splintered, was recorded as new. A sack of meal, a side of fatback, a twist of twine, each entry in the ledger, kept by Silas's son, Boo, was a new link in a chain. Elijah couldn't read the numbers, but he could feel their weight. The fields were a green hell. Under the furious Delta sun, they chopped the weeds, their bodies slick with sweat that attracted clouds of gnats. Cora and Ben worked beside him while the younger ones, Sarah and little Micah, carried water. The land, as predicted, fought back. Thick clay that sucked at boots, hidden roots that jarred the arms. One afternoon, Sheriff Tate rode the perimeter on his bay mare. He stopped, looking down at Elijah. "Heard you signed with Silas. Good man. You keep your head down and work, you'll be all right. This county don't take kindly to idle hands or ingrates." His hand rested on the butt of his pistol, a casual, terrifying punctuation. As May bled into June, the cotton plants sprouted, their progress agonizingly slow. Elijah's mind, however, raced. He saw the numbers in Bo Ransom's ledger blooming faster than the cotton. He felt the invisible walls of the contract tightening. The promise of a third of the crop felt like a mirage, shimmering and unreachable on a horizon of endless rows. True freedom, he realized that night as Cora rubbed liniment into his aching shoulders, wasn't just the absence of chains. It was the ability to understand the words that bound you. It was the power to say no. It was the right to walk away without being hunted. He had none of those things. He had only the land, the sun, and a deepening fear that the paper he'd marked was a life sentence written in a language he'd been forbidden to learn. By July, the cotton fields were a sea of dark green, dotted with the first stubborn, creamy bolls. To Silas Ransom, riding the fence line in his buckboard, it was a sight of beauty, a promise of dividends, a new carriage for his wife, maybe a political donation to secure that judgeship. White gold, the foundation of his world. To Elijah, bent double in the row, it was a prison whose bars grew thicker every day. The chopping phase was over. Now came the plucking of early bolls and constant vigilance. The heat was a physical force pressing down from a bleached sky. Elijah's hands, once calloused from carpentry, were now a network of cuts and punctures from the sharp, star-shaped burrs of the cotton. Cora wrapped her fingers in rags, but the fibers still found their way in, festering in tiny, painful infections. Ben worked like a man, his slight frame taut with strain. "PA," he panted during a water break, ladling tepid water from the barrel. "Moses, he's gone." Elijah froze. Old man Moses, who'd worked the adjacent plot for 20 years. "Gone where?" "Don't know. Just gone." Last night, Ransom's men, their reels stirred up. A cold dread trickled down Elijah's spine. Leaving was the unforgivable sin. The contract was one thing, but the unwritten law was absolute. The land owned your labor, and by extension you. That evening, the proof arrived. Sheriff Tate and 2 deputies rode into the quarter, dragging a stumbling figure behind a horse. It was Moses. His face was a mask of dried blood and dirt, his shirt torn. The sheriff halted before the gathered, silent families. "This man broke his contract," Tate announced, his voice cutting through the thick air. "Tried to steal away like a thief in the night, abandoned his lawful debt to Mr. Ransom. The law don't abide that. Justice has been served." They untied him and let him collapse in the dust. As Tate turned his horse, he looked directly at Elijah. "A reminder. A man's word is his bond. A mark is a mark, you all understand?" They understood. Moses's family, weeping, carried him inside. His plot would be given to another, his debt absorbed by his kin. The system was self-cleansing, ruthless. The incident birthed a new ritual in the Carter shack. After prayers, by the dim light of a single lamp, Ben would take a charred stick from the fire and smooth out a patch of dirt on the floor. "Teach me, Pa," he'd say. And Elijah, from the faint, struggling memories of a forbidden childhood lesson from a brave old woman in the slave quarters, would draw letters. A for axe, B for boy, C for cotton. He pointed to the sack in the corner. "See, cotton. That's what has us. We gotta know its name, son. We gotta know the words." Cora would listen, her knitting needles clicking a steady rhythm of anxiety. She was pregnant again. Another mouth to feed, another body to count against their share, another soul born into the ledger. One Sunday they risked the walk to the Woodland Chapel, a pine-plank church hidden in a cypress brake. Here the air was different. The hymns, "Steal Away," "Wade in the Water," carried old codes. The preacher, Brother Ephraim, didn't just speak of the promised land. He spoke of the Illinois Central Railroad, of jobs in Chicago stacking lumber, of schools where black children could learn openly. After the service, men huddled outside. Elijah heard whispers of a man who'd made it to Memphis, who wrote letters about wages paid in cash, not credit. Hope, dangerous and intoxicating, flickered, but on the long walk home they passed the Ransom store. Boo was on the porch, cleaning a rifle. He didn't speak, just ran a cloth slowly down the barrel, his eyes following them until they were out of sight. The message was clearer than any sermon the cotton was watching. The gold was cursed, and the Delta had long, unforgiving arms. Harvest. The word that once carried the promise of reckoning, of settlement, now hung over the quarter like the smell of impending rain. The fields exploded in a froth of white, a cruel mockery of snow. For the Carters, every waking moment was consumed by the pick. Dawn to dusk, backs permanently bent, fingers flying. The sack dragged behind Elijah, its weight a growing comfort. More weight meant more cotton meant a chance. Sarah, only 7, trailed with a smaller sack. Micah, 4, was tasked with staying out of the way, his world the dusty furrow at the edge of the field. Cora, her pregnancy now visible, worked until she swayed, her face pale under the sun. They were not alone. Silent, grim families dotted the white ocean, a forced community of desperation. The only sounds were the snick of bowls being plucked, the rustle of sacks, and the occasional bark of an overseer. Ransom had hired extra hands, rollers, men with reputations for violence who patrolled the edges. One, a giant called Hacksaw, carried a bullwhip coiled on his belt. Its purpose was never stated, only displayed. One afternoon, Ben's sack strap broke, spilling a morning's work. As he scrambled to gather the precious fluff, Hacksaw rode over. "You wasting Mr. Ransom's property, boy?" "No, sir," Ben stammered. "Strap broke, is all." The whip uncoiled like a living thing, cracking in the air a foot from Ben's head. The sound was a gunshot. Everyone in earshot froze. "Then you best hold it together," Hacksaw sneered, "or you'll be holding your insides next." Old Elijah, 50 yards away, felt the crack in his own soul. He stood, hands clenched, meeting Hacksaw's gaze across the cotton. For a long, deadly moment, the world narrowed to the two of them. To intervene was to invite destruction upon his whole family. The ledger in Bo Ransom's office had a column for insubordination, and its price was high. He bent back to his work, the taste of shame copper sharp in his mouth. Ben, trembling, retied his sack. Finally, the last bull was picked. The wagons piled high with the fragile, valuable fleece trundled toward the gin. A week of tense silence followed. The weighing, the ginning, the sale. All of it happened in a world closed to the Carters. Then, the summons. Silas Ransom sat behind his broad desk, the ledger open before him like a sacred text. Boo stood at his shoulder, smirking. Sheriff Tate lounged by the door. Elijah, Silas began, his voice almost sorrowful. You worked hard. I see that. Your family picked adequately. He ran a finger down the page. Your share of the sale for your third of the yield from your 40 acres comes to $127. A spark ignited in Elijah's chest. $127. It was more cash than he'd ever held. He could almost feel its weight. However, Silas continued, pulling a second sheet forward. We must settle your account. He began to read, a monotonous drone of numbers. CD 45, tools repair and wear 38, meal meat, rent for the dwelling hive at hen 50, medical fee for when Cora had the fever in August and 15, interest on extended credit 42. The numbers piled up, a landslide burying the tiny spark. Silas finished, sighed, and looked up. The total of your debt, Elijah, is $184. The room tilted, bit the crop, leaves you in arrears. You owe the Ransom estate $57. Elijah's mouth was dry as dust. I got no money, Mr. Ransom. I know, Silas said, spreading his hands. It's a predicament, but a man must honor his debts. The law requires it. So, we'll carry it over. You'll work for me next year. Your debt, plus next year's expenses and a reasonable interest, will be settled against next year's crop. It was a life sentence. Next year would be worse. The numbers would forever outrun the cotton. And to ensure your continued participation, Sheriff Tate spoke from the door, his voice casual. We'll need to file this lien. Means you can't sell any property to pay another. Not that you have any. And it means if you try to leave, well, that's breach and fraud. I'd have to bring you in. Elijah walked back to the quarter in a daze. The shack, when he arrived, felt smaller, meaner. Cora read his face and began to cry silently. Ben just stared at the dirt floor, at the faded letters he'd drawn. That night, the sound of a distant gunshot echoed across the fields. Then, a commotion down the lane. They peered out to see a torchlit procession. Two of Ransom's rollers were dragging the body of a young man from the Johnson family. He'd been caught, they shouted, trying to hop a freight train north. Thief. Hacksaw roared to the gathered, terrified faces. Tried to steal himself away from an honest debt. Let this be a lesson. They left the body in the road as a warning. The law, Sheriff Tate, was notably absent. The ledger was one noose. The violence was another. And the Carter family was caught in the grip of both, choking on the white gold that was the Delta's curse. Woodland Chapel hummed with a different energy that Sunday. The horror of the Johnson boy lay thick in the air, a poison no hymn could fully cleanse. Brother Ephraim's sermon was not from the book of Psalms, but from the book of survival. They think our bodies are theirs. He intoned, his voice low but carrying to the rafters. They think our children are their future field hands. They think this land holds us by divine right. He paused, looking at every face. But God gave us minds. He gave us feet. And He gave us a promised land that ain't always a place in the hereafter. Sometimes it's a train station. After the final hymn, the women and children filed out. The men remained, the doors closed. This was the secret meeting within the sanctuary. Brother Ephraim got straight to it. Isaiah got a letter from his cousin in St. Louis. He held up a creased envelope. He's working at the stockyards. Makes $8 a week. Cash money. His boy's in a school. A collective inhalation. $8 a week. Clear money. The Illinois Central runs to Chicago. Another man, Jeremiah, whispered, from Granada. I heard you can get a ticket if you got the money. And how we get that? Elijah asked, the memory of his negative $57 burning. They watch every penny. They own the store, the land, the law. We can't save a dime. We can't save their dimes, Ephraim corrected. We find another way. He outlined the plan, born of desperation and whispered networks. It wasn't about stealing cotton. That was suicide. It was about the things they owned, however meager. A hand-carved stool. A quilt sewn from 100 scraps. A smoked ham from a pig raised in secret. A small sack of peas grown in a hidden garden patch. There's a man, Ephraim said. A Jewish peddler named of Abramowitz. He comes through the back roads every month. He buys and sells. He don't talk to ransom. He pays cash. It was dangerous. Selling anything outside the plantation economy was a violation of the unwritten code. But it was a threat of agency. Over the next month, a quiet revolution took place. Cora worked late into the night on a second quilt, her fingers flying. Elijah, a skilled woodworker in secret, fashioned a beautiful crib from river birch for the new baby, knowing it would be sold, not used. Ben trapped rabbits in the swamp, smoking the meat. Little Sarah collected discarded scraps of pretty cloth. The tension was a live wire. Every stranger's glance was a potential threat. Every visit from the rollers felt like discovery. Elijah started waking at night, listening for the sound of horses. The day of the peddler's arrival, Elijah met him deep in the cypress brake, a bundle under his arm. Abramowitz was a small, nervous man with kind eyes. He examined the crib, the quilt, the other small items. He didn't haggle much. $17, he said finally, counting out the worn bills. $17, a fortune. A ticket to Granada cost $5. Food for the journey, maybe 3 more. It was a start, a pitiful, glorious start. But as Elijah hid the money in a tin buried beneath the shack, a new fear took root. $17 wouldn't get a family of 5, soon to be 6, to Chicago. It was a seed, but the harvest was impossibly far away. And the system had eyes. A few days later, Bo Ransom rode up to the shack as Elijah was mending a hoe. "Heard you been doing some fine carpentry, Elijah," Bew said, his voice slick as oil. "My daddy needs a new set of bookshelves. You can do that for us. We'll put it on your account." It wasn't a request. It was a test, a reassertion of control. To refuse would raise suspicion. To agree would consume the time he needed to make more items to sell. "Yes, sir," Elijah said, his heart sinking. "I can do that." The plan, so fragile, felt the first boot step of its destruction. The sanctuary of the church offered a map to freedom, but the plantation was a labyrinth designed to keep them lost. They were gathering stones to build a bridge, but the tide of oppression kept rising, threatening to wash everyone away. Winter in the Delta was a gray, muddy purgatory. The fields were barren, the debt dormant but feeding on interest in Boo Ransom's ledger. Elijah spent his days in Ransom's barn, crafting the bookshelves, each stroke of the plane feeling like he was building his own cage. Cora's time was near. The extra work, the malnourishment, had taken its toll. Her face was drawn, her movements slow. The promised medical fee from the ledger meant the plantation doctor, a doorman who saw freedmen as livestock, might grudgingly attend, but no one trusted him. The breaking point came on a night sliced through with icy rain. Cora's labor began hard and fast. Old Auntie May, the midwife, was sent for, but the rollers, bored and cruel, delayed her at the quarters entrance, demanding to know her business. Inside the shack, Cora screamed, a sound of pure animal anguish that tore through Elijah. He held her hand, watching her life seem to seep away into the ragged mattress. Ben was sent running into the storm to literally beg the doctor. The doctor never came. Auntie May, finally allowed through, did her best with whispered prayers and ancient remedies. After hours of torment, a baby girl was born, tiny and silent. For a heart-stopping minute, she did not cry. Auntie May rubbed her, breathed into her, until a weak, mewling sound emerged. Cora, exhausted and bleeding, fell into a troubled sleep. The baby, named Hope by a weeping Sarah, was too small. The next morning, as a pale dawn leaked through the cracks, Elijah stood over his family. Cora looked aged, broken. Hope's faint cries were like the sound of a closing trap. The debt now included this, the life of his wife, the fragility of his child, all under a system that valued them less than a bale of cotton. Something in him, long bent, finally snapped. It was not a loud break, but a quiet, fundamental realignment. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but it was now outweighed by a colder certainty. To stay was to watch them die, piece by piece. He dug up the tin. $17. He went to the loose floorboard and pulled out the small, secret store of items he'd managed to make since the bookshelves. 2 more small carvings, a butter churn. He woke Ben. "Go to Jeremiah. Tell him we need to see Abramowitz. Now. Not next month. Tomorrow." Ben, seeing the new light in his father's eyes, didn't question. He vanished into the mist. The next day, under the pretext of checking rabbit traps, Elijah met the peddler. He sold everything, even the good hoe. He came back with $32 total. A pittance for a new life, a fortune for a chance. The plan was insanity. They couldn't all go at once. The rollers watched the roads. The train station was a beacon of surveillance. The great migration for the Carters would have to happen in pieces. "You and Ben go first," Cora insisted, her voice thin but firm. You get work, you send for us. They won't watch the women and children as close once the head of the household is gone to find work. It was a common, tragic ruse, men leaving for seasonal work, never returning. It might work. The thought of leaving them made Elijah sick, but the thought of all of them being caught on the road was worse. They chose a moonless night 2 days hence. The goodbyes were silent, tearless, full of crushing hugs and promises whispered into hair. Elijah gave Cora $10, hid 15 on himself and 2 on Ben. They took only the clothes on their backs and a small sack with a little food. At midnight, they slipped out the back into the swallowing darkness of the swamp, avoiding the roads entirely. They would walk the 20 miles to the next county, to a tiny depot where the train didn't stop but slowed enough for a desperate man to board. The mud sucked at their feet. Every rustle in the cane was a possum, a dog, a roller. They navigated by memory and the faint glow of the stars. Ben, for the first time, was not a boy. He was a partner in escape, his eyes wide, his hearing acute. Just before dawn, as they reached the edge of the woods bordering the rail line, they heard it. Dogs. Distant but clear, baying with a purpose that was not hunting coon. Elijah's blood turned to ice. Someone had talked, or been seen, or it was just the ever-present suspicion. Run, Ben, he hissed. Follow the tracks north. The train comes at first light. You get on it, you hear me? You get on. Pie! I can't! Will.
For your mama. For Sarah.
For Hope. Go, he pushed his son toward the rail bed. Ben, tears cutting trails through the grime on his face, gave one last look and then ran, a shadow swallowed by the gloom. Elijah turned back, drawing the dogs away. He crashed through the underbrush, making noise. The baying grew closer, excited. He saw a torchlight flicker through the trees. Hacksaw's voice yelling. He ran until his lungs burned, until the torches were close enough to feel their heat. Then he stopped in a small clearing and waited, his hands raised. He had no weapon but his body, which he would now use as a diversion. The dogs reached him first, snarling circles. Then the men on horses, Hacksaw and 2 others, silhouetted against the torches. Well, Hacksaw grinned, dismounting. The carpenter flies the coop. Where you think you're going, debt breaker? Elijah said nothing. He was counting seconds in his head, putting distance between the dogs and his running son. Where's the boy? Hacksaw demanded, backhanding him across the face. Elijah tasted blood. He smiled, a red-stained, defiant thing. Gone. The whip came out then. The first lash tore his shirt and his skin. The pain was bright and terrible. But as the blows fell, Elijah Carter clung to a single, soaring thought, a prayer sent into the fading night, a run, Ben. Run and don't you ever look back. The lash was fire. The third stroke opened a furrow across Elijah's back that felt like it reached his soul. He collapsed to his knees in the muddy clearing, the world narrowing to the pain. The panting of the dogs and Hacksaw's furious grunts. Should string you up right here. Hacksaw spat, coiling the bloody whip. But Mr. Ransom, he likes his accounts settled proper. The law'll have its due first. They dragged him, semi-conscious, back to the plantation. Not to the quarter, but to the old smokehouse, a windowless brick building that still carried the ghostly scent of hams and terror. They threw him on the dirt floor and locked the door. The darkness was absolute. The pain was a universe. But in that void, Elijah's mind was crystal clear. Had he made it? Had the train come? The calculation of time and distance was the only thing that kept him from screaming. Hours later, the door creaked open. Silas Ransom entered, holding a lantern. Sheriff Tate followed. Silas's face was a mask of cold disappointment. Elijah, he sighed, setting the lantern down. This is a profound betrayal. The debt, the contract, the lien. You were trying to deprive me of my lawful property, your labor. And you incited your son to do the same. That's a crime against the peace of this county. My son is free. Elijah rasped, the words grating from a dry throat. You don't own his mark. Sheriff Tate chuckled. He's a minor. His labor belonged to the head of his household, who is in debt to Mr. Ransom. By law, his labor is an asset. You've stolen that asset. That's fraud. That's 5 years of hard labor in the state penitentiary. Or, he gestured to Silas, you can accept Mr. Ransom's merciful alternative. Silas stepped forward. The debt is now $80 with penalties. You will work for me under guard, for no share until it is paid. Your wife and children will work the plot to cover their own upkeep. Any further defiance, and I will press charges, and you will rot in Parchman Farm, and I will sell their labor to settle the remainder. It was a perfect trap. Eternal, generational servitude. Elijah closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he didn't see the smokehouse. He saw Ben's face, lit by a distant hope. He heard Cora's voice teaching Sarah her letters in the dirt. He felt the impossibly light weight of baby hope. He had one card left to play, a desperate final gamble. "I'll sign," Elijah whispered, opening his eyes. "A new contract for all of us, but not here. I want my family. I want to sign it at the store in front of the clerk. Make it legal, so there's no more misunderstanding." The Silas and Tate exchanged a glance. The request was odd, but it spoke of surrender, of a broken man seeking the cold comfort of legality. It appealed to Silas's sense of order. "All right," Silas said. "Tomorrow morning." The next day, under heavy guard, Elijah was marched to the ransom store. His back was on fire, his steps unsteady. Cora, Sarah, and Micah were already there, her face pale with fear, clutching the baby. Ben's absence hung over them like a ghost. The new contract was on the counter. It was worse than the last. A 90-10 split, all family labor included, a 20-year term to pay the debt. "Your mark, Elijah," Silas said, proffering the pen. The store was crowded with rollers, with Boo, with the clerk. The door was open, sunlight streaming in. In that sunlight, Elijah saw a tiny, brave movement. Sarah, only 7, looked at him and then deliberately knocked a jar of pickles off the counter near the door. It shattered with a tremendous crash. Everyone flinched, turning toward the noise. In that split second of distraction, Elijah moved. Not toward the door, but toward the lantern sitting on the dry goods counter. With a sweep of his arm, he smashed the glass chimney and flung the open flame into a pile of burlap sacks and seed packets. Fire erupted with a hungry whoosh, instantly climbing the tinder-dry wood walls. "You fool!" Silas roared, chaos erupting. Men scrambled for water, shouting, stumbling over each other. Amid the bedlam, Elijah grabbed Cora's arm and shoved her and the children toward the back of the store, away from the main commotion at the front. "The window," he hissed. The small, high window in the storage room was nailed shut, but he threw a sack of flour against it, shattering the glass. He boosted Micah, then Sarah through, helped Cora with the baby. As he turned to follow, a hand clamped on his shoulder. Hacksaw, face black with soot and rage. "You're dead," he snarled. Elijah didn't fight. He reached back, grabbing a burning length of timber from a shelf and thrust it into Hacksaw's face. The man screamed, recoiling. Elijah dove through the window, glass tearing at his clothes, and landed in the dirt alley. His family was there, terrified but ready. "The swamp," he ordered. "To the old meeting place." They ran, not as fugitives now, but as a burning declaration of war. Behind them, the ransom store was an orange pyre against the Delta sky, a signal fire of their rebellion. They hid for 2 days in the cypress brake, living on roots and rainwater, listening to the distant sounds of search parties. The fire had bought them time, confusion. On the 3rd night, under a cloak of fog, they made their way to the remote depot. A sympathetic black porter, part of the secret network, had gotten a message from Jeremiah. He hustled them into an empty freight car just as the northbound train began to chug away from the slowing stop. As the car lurched into motion, Elijah pulled his family close. They were filthy, starving, wounded, and free. Out the slats of the car, he watched the dark, oppressive silhouette of the Delta recede, the endless cotton fields giving way to piney woods. They had no money, no destination, no guarantee. But they had each other. And somewhere ahead in the vast, unknown north was Ben. He would find work. He would save. He would wait. The train whistle blew, a long, mournful, triumphant cry that cut through the night. It wasn't a sound of arrival, but of departure. It was the sound of a chain breaking. It was the first note of a new song, hard and uncertain, but theirs to sing. The Great Migration had begun with a single, shattered family, fleeing the white-gold prison, carrying nothing but the scars of the ledger and the unquenchable fire of hope. If you were moved by Elijah's journey from the chains of debt to the hope of the rails, then you understand the untold stories that built a nation. This is just one thread in a vast tapestry of struggle and resilience. For more true stories of courage, survival, and the relentless pursuit of freedom against impossible odds, please share this story and subscribe to Tales of Slavery. Keep these memories alive. Our history depends on it.